All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching this video. I've been wanting to do this video for a long time, kind of a review slash rant of The Last of Us 2, and I really wanted to take my time with this game, giving it the full credit it deserves before coming around to it a week later, now that the dust has settled. A couple of quick housekeeping things. First, there will be spoilers. So if you haven't played The Last of Us 2, haven't finished the game, or played the first game, you are fair warned. Secondly, keep the comments civil. I know there's some really vitriolic dialogue going on in the comments for this type of video, as a lot of people feel very passionate about this franchise. But if you want to thumbs down my video, if you want to just leave a comment that disagrees with me, I'm more than happy. But just try and keep it civil. And yeah, okay, here we go. Now, initially, I was actually going to write up a whole script and really just record that. But the more I thought about this game, the more I just thought it would be better to get my unfiltered opinions about it from every aspect. And quite honestly, that would have taken too long. So why don't I start with The Last of Us 2 from a technical perspective? Because I think that's the easiest thing to get out of the way first. And I have to say that the developers at Naughty Dog have really gone out of their way to make something beautiful. First off, let's start with the graphics, which at first I wasn't too impressed with, in the sense that I didn't think they were that much of an upgrade. But you know what? Taking in all the little details of this game, The Last of Us 2 is really a technical marvel. Not only is it one of the best looking games on the PS4, but right down when you get to the small details, it really is something to behold, from the foliage in a lot of the city areas to the wildlife. I remember coming across a stagnant pool of water in a jacuzzi in a backyard, and on further inspection, there was actually little minnows swimming inside the pool. So, I mean, this game just really takes into account a lot of little things. Throughout the 30-hour or so runtime, you'll not only be exploring a ruined Seattle, which in and of itself is quite impressive. You'll be looking through empty stores, courthouses, spas, bakeries, you name it, and the attention to the detail on just the little things in each of these is amazing. The weather effects, the lighting effects are really something else, especially the snow in the winter scenes, the rain in the spring scenes. When you go underwater, every little detail. There's a lot of little details that you kind of miss out, that you could tell that a lot of care and attention was put into the game by the developers. Secondly, the music and the sound design. The music really evokes this kind of sad, depressing kind of atmosphere, and that just goes to the stellar composer. I forget his name at the moment. I think his first name is Gustavo, but it's very subdued. When the action ramps up, it actually helps with a lot of the tension when you play it. The sound effects, sound design, wow, some of the best. I mean, this is on par with some Hollywood films. Everything from the sound of an explosion to the sound of a bullet ricocheting off of a cement block, to just the amount of sound effects the infected have, whether it's I forget what they're called, bloaters, I think they're called, gurgling, or the weird clicking of the clickers. And this goes to also, depending on where you are, like if you're underground, there's a bit of an echo and it resonates and it carries quite a bit. But if you're above ground in an open area, it sounds a lot more just distinctive. Really, really fascinating stuff. The cinematography of this game is gorgeous, and cinematography and art direction, the way the camera moves in any given scene is, again, on par with any kind of Hollywood blockbuster movie out there. It's really amazing how a lot of video games these days, they're taking a lot of care into how they film their games, which is really weird because you're not supposed to really film games. You're supposed to play the games. And this game really sets it apart, not only from its precursor, but also, other games that are today, like God of War does a really good job of doing this. BioShock did a good job of this despite being a first-person perspective. There are other games out there, but this really takes it to another level. So hats off to the developers at Naughty Dog. Similarly, all the accessibility options are just really fascinating. I think this might be the most accessible game out there. And what I mean by that is there are a plethora of options that people with either hearing impairments, or have some kind of visual impairments, or have some kind of can't hold controllers right, or have some kind of physical impairments. This might be the most accessible game for people with disabilities out there. So it's really stunning the amount of things you could change in this game to help you if you have any sort of malady, disability, impairment like that. So it was clear that the developers spent a lot of time and consulted with a lot of people in this vein. And I really hope that games going on in the future, games that are developed in the future rather, follow suit. Just impressive to see it all around. So where do we start with this review? Well, I think the best place to start after just talking about it on a technical level is obviously the story, because for me, I think this is a lot of where the game falls apart, takes a lot of missteps. So what better way to start than with Joel's death, because I think that seems to be the most polarizing aspect of this game. And I have to say, just taking a step back, this game has not only divided the fan base, there seems to be a very kind of love it or hate it mentality. But for me personally, this game was very polarizing internally for myself, because this is just a generalization for me coming at the game. While it was fun to play, and while on a technical level it is a masterpiece, I would argue, the story kind of falls flat. And I had to ask kind of deeper philosophical questions of video games, such as, can a game still be fun if the story kind of falls short? And normally that would not be a problem. But in this case, because it's such a narrative-driven game, it did for me. And, for better or worse, and I'll get into this later, Naughty Dog will be a game that changes the industry for the better in the long run. It wasn't the game I expected, and I'm not saying that in a good way. It's hard to believe that it took them 7 years to develop this game, and that was the story they settled on. But let's start with Joel's death, since I think it comes very early on in the game. It's really the precipitating event that sends the story into kind of full gear, for lack of a better word. So in the beginning, Joel is killed by Abby and her friends, who are members of the the WLF. I found myself calling it the WTF throughout this game because the story at times just made me question everything about storytelling and what a good story is. By the way, throughout this whole thing, I'm probably going to mistake a few names here and there, calling Abby Ellie and Ellie Abby, only because their names sound so familiar. So it starts out with Tommy and Joel very early on out on patrol, and they rescue a girl named Abby, or a woman named Abby, from an infected horde, and they soon take refuge in an abandoned lodge or resort. And approaching this scene, it has been commented on that basically Joel and Tommy reveal their true names to complete strangers, and the argument to that is that they would never do this, as Joel warns Ellie in the previous game not to give your real name, because you never know what strangers are going to, what kind of intentions they're going to have. And you know what? This part didn't actually bother me for two reasons, and these have been cited as well. The first is they're really running high on adrenaline at this point, so maybe it was a mistake on both of them, but that they reveal their true names. And that's actually kind of understandable. You know, when you're in a panic state, you don't really think straight, and so that part didn't really bother me. But the second is, I think, goes down to a deeper core of humanity, wherein, this is Joel. This is 4 years after the events of the first game, and for the most part, he has been safe and secure in the town of Jackson, Wyoming. And I think over the years, he's kind of reclaiming his humanity back, slowly but surely. And, the better part of it gets him in this scene, relying more on the kindness of strangers. His death, I think, was a necessity, if anything else, for this game. I don't agree with how it was carried out and that it was carried out so early, but, in the first game, Joel is basically a murderer as trying to survive against all odds in this tough, unforgiving world. He kills dozens, if not hundreds, of human characters, and the fact that Abby comes back to seek retribution against him for killing her father at the end of the last game, who happened to be the surgeon that was about to operate on Ellie with the Fireflies. That's just par for the course in this world. It could have easily been a family member or friend of anyone of the people he killed in the last game. And really, this is just the chickens coming home to roost for Joel. It is also kind of reinforces the fact that this is a world where heroes don't get the deaths shining, going out in a blaze of glory like Obi-Wan Kenobi, where death, whether it's by infected or at the hands of other humans, comes suddenly, it comes swiftly, and it is unforgiving at times. So that didn't bother me so much. It was not a deal breaker for me when it happened. And judging from all the vitriolic responses, emotional responses of fans that are coming out that we've seen in reaction videos over the internet, that's certainly understandable. I don't agree with it, but I think the death scene could have been carried out later in the game. I think part of the anger, quite honestly, and I agree with this, comes because it happened so soon in the game. The fact that a lot of Joel's story in the years between when they arrive at Jackson and the present day is told through flashbacks. While those scenes are good in and of themselves, they're told in a very disjointed manner, and you really just don't get a lot of screen time with Joel in this game, and that's understandable. This is very much Ellie's story, but I think players would have liked a lot of time with Joel in the beginning hours of this game. Whether that means taking the flashbacks and putting them in order, which I think would have done a better job. Seeing Joel and Ellie's development in the years since being at Jackson, or just creating another story entirely, but wherein, Joel's death comes later in the game, I think would have... Because right now, when Joel dies very early on in the game, it's, aside from being the precipitating event that, puts things in motion, it's really just played for shock value. And once it happens, we don't get a lot of time to grieve as the player. I mean, Joel was kind of like a father figure, not only to Ellie, he was a father figure to us. And we loved him that way. And other than kind of a short clip of him, of Ellie, just going through his house and taking his things, in the next scene, it's pretty much, 2 weeks later and we're already in Seattle day one. Moods are changed, and it's kind of like it's a real change in tone that the player doesn't get to, our adrenaline's pumping. We're very much still in grief, and it seems kind of counterintuitive to what the game is presenting to us at this point in time. So, again, those are my thoughts on the death. Again, at this point of playing it, Ellie's storyline on the whole is actually pretty good, I would say. It has its own issues, but I really had no qualms with it insofar as, it was telling an interesting story. It was telling a linear story. I didn't like the fact that it just kind of glossed over straight up from Wyoming to Seattle. I also thought it would have been more effective if instead of showing in a flashback where Ellie goes to Utah to kind of find and unearth the secrets of really what happened with the Fireflies in the first game, I think it would have been great if that was actually part of the game, where she goes alone, as I think she's 17 at that point, to the Utah hospital, finds the truth essentially, and it devastates her. I think that would have had a much more of an impact in the larger scheme of this game. But again, I digress. A lot of people are probably going to say, well, you didn't get the game you wanted, and that's why you hate it. And you know what? I think actually that's fair. I think a lot of people didn't get the game they wanted. And, we can speculate all we want to consumers review bombing Metacritic scores because they saw Joel, their favorite character, die. But at the same time, you can make the argument that if the consumer scores were so low in the second game, but they were on par, glowing, and near perfect in the first game, why is that? And if it's not from a technical perspective, you have to start questioning everything else from a story perspective. Now, before I go forward, I think I should. Let's talk about the fact that Ellie is a lesbian character. There's a lot of bisexual lesbian characters. There's a trans character in Abby's storyline later on in the game, and to be honest, this didn't bother me at all. I thought they treated them with great respect. I thought they treated them. I mean, this game is, as far as LGBTQ characters handling their issues. I didn't. First of all, it didn't bother me at all. I don't know why I would. And I didn't know that this was actually a criticism by some people until after I finished the game and watching the reviews. I think that's kind of stupid, if I'm being honest. I think this game really does them a service. And it really goes into Dina's... I actually like Dina quite a bit. It goes into the relationship between, a girl kind of coming of age, dealing with her own sexuality, but also just telling a pretty good story overall. It really just shows how she's changed over the years. I like Dina's character. I think the banter between them is pretty good. Would have liked to see Dina's character, she's sort of just really the love interest. I hate saying that for Ellie. Would have seen her character develop a little more. We don't really know much about her either than, spoiler alert, she becomes pregnant, or she became pregnant with Jesse's baby, and that she's Ellie's girlfriend. I don't know if there's any more to her than that. But again, that goes to some of the other sub-characters. I'm going to focus on Ellie's story for the moment. Jesse, we don't really... I mean, he's cool, but we really don't know... We know even less about him, if we're being honest. Tommy's character is really weird in this game because, Joel is killed, and right from the get-go, Ellie tells Tommy that she's going to go after him, but he leaves a day early, or he's actually left a day earlier, even though he knew that Ellie was probably going to go after Joel in Seattle. So she kind of has to deal with a lot of the fallout in the 3 days where she's in Seattle of Tommy's actions there. And it kind of really doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. I mean, when you think about it, wouldn't it have made more sense to have, Ellie, Dina, and Tommy go together, or just Ellie and Tommy go together and kind of really feel that kind of collective grief and loss? I don't know. I always just think it's something to think about. This game's plot is kind of wafer thin for Ellie, and it's not, which is fine. It's a straight up revenge story, and revenge stories are fine. But once you start to get to Abby's story, I'll be touching it more when we get to her part. It becomes a very generalized theme of revenge. I think if you want to dig deeper into this game as far as themes go, this is more... The better, I think, lesson is finding justice and seeking justice, or dealing with loss and dealing with grief and the unresolved feelings that come with that over time. I think the themes of revenge are actually just very general in this thing. Revenge is bad, I think, is a lot of the temperament, or whatever you want to call it, sensibilities, discussion going around, and that is absolutely true. But the bigger controversy for me was about halfway through this game, and this should be no surprise, a lot of people had problems with this, when it completely changes perspectives from Ellie to Abby, who is a soldier in the, I was about to say WTF, in the WLF, and this is where, for me, the story falls apart for a number of reasons, and probably a few reasons that a lot of gamers didn't see coming or didn't realize, because I certainly didn't see this in the review. So I'm going to talk about a little how the gameplay influences the story or the narrative, because I think it speaks to larger issues with the game. So Naughty Dog frames its narratives in a very specific way. And that is, aside from maybe, in the Uncharted games, an opening action scene, you get about maybe 2 or 3 hours of narrative-driven gameplay, whether that means just, taking in the setting, taking in the plot of the game. It's very low-key. It's very low stakes. You kind of get absorbed in the narrative slowly before any of the big action set pieces come to fruition. And that is very much true with the previous Last of Us game. So when you're suddenly, after Abby's flashback, thrown into her storyline, you're also basically starting from scratch. And not just starting from scratch in terms of story, you're starting from scratch in terms of weapons, you're starting from scratch in terms of developing those weapons, and also in terms of the skill trees. And you realize when you start, touring the WLF base, when you start playing her, relearning your friends, you're basically starting from scratch again. And I think this is where part of the story... First of all, I'll just say this straight up. I did not like the fact that I had to play as Abby in this game. I think the themes of what I'm calling managing empathy really fell flat on its face with the telling of Abby's character, because it's no secret what Druckmann was trying to do, in that he wanted to kind of... Redeem is not the right word, but he wanted the player to feel sympathy for a character who was essentially a murderer, in the same way that we felt for Joel, who was also a murderer, essentially. But he did so out of love, he did so out of protection for Ellie, and in that way, in that manner, it wasn't just survival. It was on a different level when it was doing it for protecting Ellie. And, the last game is a lot about Ellie and Joel. We see their road story. We see them developing their relationship over time. At first they kind of hate each other. Then they kind of go through stuff. They go through hardships, and they develop that bond. And they really want to do kind of the same thing with Abby and her storyline in half the time. But getting back to how the gameplay kind of influences the poor narrative, as I would say, you basically have to start from scratch. And the first couple of hours of Abby's storyline, while it's interesting, you get to see how the WLF live. You get to see, her side of the world, how they're just humans struggling to get by. While it's somewhat interesting, you're basically playing a walking simulator for the first 2 or 3 hours of her storyline again. So it sort of comes off as filler, but because you have to develop her skill trees faster, because you have to develop her weapons faster in like half the time, you'll often come across huge caches of whether it be weapons, ammo, parts, supplements, and the whole thing just kind of feels disjointed. The other thing that personally I didn't like with the game is you get a completely different set of weapons with Ellie as you do with Abby. Because I'm more the stealth type, I liked Ellie's weapons much better. I'm a huge fan of the Molotov, the trip mine, or the trap mine as they call it here. I like her bow and arrow, especially the explosive arrows, the ways those things just explode and turn people to shreds. Granted, I did like Abby's hunting pistol. The crossbow was okay, but it was very much for kind of an aggro style of gameplay. The fact that you had pipe bombs instead of more inventive explosives, I think people, from what I've been reading and hearing, a lot of people prefer Abby's weapons, that kind of aggro style of gameplay. So I think I'm kind of in the minority of liking Ellie's weapons more. The other mechanic that I'm kind of quite shocked they changed, and they actually addressed this in an interview, Naughty Dog, was the fact that Ellie can basically go around and shiv anyone she wants from the back and the front, apparently, at least on the normal mode, and at no cost to using her resources. And if you recall in the last game, at least this is how I remember it, in the last game, if you wanted to quickly kill a person or an infected, granted they weren't alerted to your presence, you had to not only craft a shiv, but you had to actually come up behind them and do a stealth kill. The shivs in the last game also had a dual purpose, though. If you recall, they were used to open locked doors, and I wish they kept this shiv mechanic from the first game in the second game. Logically speaking, Ellie technically had that shiv throughout the first game, you just didn't play as her. But the fact that you can go around just literally shivving, you could literally sneak up on 90% of the enemies or 95% of the enemies, shiv all of them, and not lose a bullet of ammo. And I think that did a disservice to the gameplay. If you had the ability to craft shivs, that would have given another level to the resource management. And usually you can get around locked doors by other means. I don't know why they made it such that you could just kill anyone with impropriety. Like, if that was the case for Abby and Ellie, I wouldn't be as upset. But, they bring back the shiv mechanic, oddly enough, to Abby's character. And you're wondering, well, why did they do it for one and not the other? So it's very perplexing in that regard. I just had a thought about the gameplay as well. But yeah, I mean, it's that I lost while talking about that. So it's just weird. So basically, you're scavenging for ammo and resources and parts as you normally do, but because for the first half of the game you can literally just kill everyone with a shiv, you become over encumbered with all these items, and it doesn't add any real tension to the game. Now, maybe that's not the case for playing on like survival mode or hard mode, but I really want to play this on normal mode. It's just how I first experienced the game 7 years ago with 2013, and I gotta say, it is a hell of a lot easier. I did not once in this game, or very few times, maybe except for a handful of times, feel like I was going through any sort of tense situations. I rarely died in this game. I always felt I was controlling any situation, especially with the dog characters. They pick up your scent, you just lay a trip mine, and then boom, that's it. The silencers, you could do headshots along with the bow and arrows, and the fact that you could just sneak up on everyone and stealth kill them. So it's really perplexing. The fact that you can prone also and hide in tall, fields of grass probably made this game a lot easier too. But I mean, I digress. But it just goes to show you some of the ways in which this game is kind of inconsistent with its gameplay and its story. Also, another valid point that I saw is that Ellie, for huge swaths of her story, you get this bolt-action rifle, which is, if the WLF, you see, when you go into Abby's storyline, they have these really massive guns, even though it's like 20 years. You think ammo would be out of scarcity 20 years after a pandemic or the apocalypse, but apparently not, because they just use them for target practice. But you think, like, why doesn't Ellie, after killing a WLF soldier, just carry one of their assault rifles? Why can't she carry more than maybe, if I had to guess, 10 bullets at a time, when you can literally carry 2 large weapons, 2 smaller weapons, bricks, bottles, mines, Molotovs, and yeah, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You're telling me she can't carry like a handful of extra bullets that are virtually weightless? I don't know. This is where you start to ask questions. All right, so why don't we talk about Abby's storyline, which I think is probably, aside from Joel's death, the biggest controversy of this game. Where to start? Well, so halfway through the game, what ends up happening is Abby confronts Ellie in the movie theater, and the game kind of just cuts to black. And from that moment, aside from a brief flashback of Abby 4 years ago, I think it's something like that, you come back playing Abby's storyline from the first 3 days of being in Seattle, or the last 3 days in being Seattle. And to be honest, like, first of all, there's the whole thing about, you're playing Abby, who you actually, you really hate at this point, because up until this point, you're playing as Ellie, who wants, she wants to seek revenge on Abby, right? And the last thing you want to do is play as Abby. I mean, at least that was my experience. I hated her with such a vitriol. And, at first it starts with the flashback and you're thinking, okay, this is sort of interesting, seeing it from her side in a flashback form. But then it goes to, then you see that Seattle day one and you get that deep sinking in the pit of your stomach, and it is not a good feeling. And you essentially end up playing with this character for the next 10 to 12 hours, who is, aside from the story of her father being the surgeon that Joel killed, it is a very, well, I'll say this. Her storyline is uncompelling. You don't even get to the main storyline of hers. So you learn of some of her friends. You learn about Owen, who was her previous love interest, but he's dating Mel, and he got her pregnant, and they're not really dating anymore. You learn about her friends, but her friends are really just the most boring, insipid characters that I've had the displeasure of interacting with. I mean, it quickly kind of turns into just like a teen high school drama at this point. Abby's personal problems, I don't want to deal with them. I don't know why they went into this space. Fortunately, the game actually picks up quite a bit. You get a lot of really good set pieces, and then you get to the Seraphites, and basically what happens is Abby comes across these two Seraphites, these young acolytes, as they're called in the game, Yara and Lev, who have been excommunicated and essentially hunted down by the Seraphites, by their own kind, and she takes them in, she protects them shortly before being hanged to death, essentially. They rescue her and she rescues them, and they kind of develop this friendship. The fact, though, that this comes in so much later in her storyline, it feels like such a drag. Not Lev's story. Lev's story is actually really interesting, but the amount of time, it takes probably good maybe 5 to 6 hours before you even start that storyline. And by then, you just don't care. You're bored out of your mind. And it's just feels like a slog. All you really want to do, I hate to say this, is to get back to that theater and continue the story. Now, the bigger issue, there's actually two bigger issues that come into play with this game. And the first is the use of flashbacks, because while flashbacks used sparingly can actually be very effective, to be honest, I wasn't even that thrilled about Ellie's flashback with in the museum with Joel. I wasn't terribly a big fan of even the one where they go into that lodge and she, at the end of it questions whether or not, brings it up again, whether or not she was immune to Joel. But, having played this game, the full 30 hours of this game, I actually thought those were one of the better moments. But they do a couple of things that do a disservice to the game. And one of the things is that it breaks up the pacing. You essentially go from what is essentially a dark, action-driven game to kind of these bright, emotional scenes. And it kind of kills the atmosphere, kind of puts the action on hold. So, I mean, there's that aspect to it. But the flashbacks in Abby's storyline happen so frequently and so much, it becomes a crutch for telling the main points of her story. Basically, her past with the Fireflies, her relationship with Owen, and it doesn't really add a lot in many cases, at least with Ellie's story. It adds a lot to what happened. How did she discover, why is her relationship with Joel fractured in the second game? What led between the events at the end of the last game to the events beginning in this first game? Abby's storyline, a lot of her flashbacks are basically pointless. You ask yourself, why am I watching this? Who cares? There's a flashback to 4 months prior to the story being told, saying that Tommy is in, or they got a lead for Joel being in Jackson, Wyoming, and she's kind of trying to get them to go with her. And you're like, why do I care? you don't need a flashback in a lot of times to, in this case, you don't need a flashback to what's the word? To transmit to the player that Owen and Abby have had a previous relationship. I mean, that should be telegraphed with just the good acting of this game. You don't have to tell us that Mel's pregnant. You can show it to us. And, they even say this in an earlier scene, in one of the first scenes, that Mel's pregnant. And it's kind of inferred that, because Owen's the one telling her that she's the one that got her pregnant. You get a lot of these scenes that are just kind of, again, like memories. You get a lot of walking simulator, at that aquarium. And oh my God, that fucking aquarium. You go to this thing probably I didn't count, but if I had to guess, maybe 5 or 6 times. And by the end of it, you're just like, oh, get me out of this place. Because it's supposed to be, I guess, a metaphor for refuge or finding solace in an unforgiving world. But they really just make you go to this place. And I don't know about you. I was expecting a lot more action to happen at this aquarium. Like maybe the glass breaks and all the water goes out through the place. That would have been interesting. In any case, you're just kind of going to the same place over and over again. And the other thing because you have to remember, I'm just talking about the flashbacks that are interspersed throughout the game. I'm not even touching upon the fact, until now, that you flash back 3 days earlier in the game, right? So it kind of coincides with Ellie's storyline playing alongside Abby's storyline. So in this case, you're kind of you start with a flashback, and then it's a flashback within a flashback, and then it's going to another flashback. The whole game just feels fractured and disjointed. And right when you get to that confrontation halfway through the game, and it fades to black, after having played this game, I get the feeling one of two things happened. Either the writers got to that point and realized, oh shit, we have no idea what to do with the story at this point. What do we do? Basically, they wrote themselves into a corner. Or they knew from the onset of this game exactly what they were going to do and did and went this route anyway, which in my opinion is even more disturbing. Because it's really hard to believe that this is the same game written by Neil Druckmann. I heard that one of his lead directors from the first game, who was also very much involved in the story, kind of like a script supervisor, who kind of kept Druckmann in check, was not around for this game, and it shows. It also feels like there was no outside criticism allowed for this game at Naughty Dog. It feels like a game that had no outside input from people, or conversely, maybe it did, and Druckmann was just not having any of it. And what you get is kind of a beautiful mess as the final product. So the second thing is that the game also suffers from a lack of focus. What I mean by a lack of focus is that this game spends little time focusing on Abby's storyline as it relates to the death of Joel and the events leading up to the death of Joel, which for me is the biggest missed opportunity of this game. Instead, it goes to tell a completely different story about Abby protecting these kids, essentially, these Seraphites, from getting killed, and doesn't really focus on... It tries to get you to empathize with Abby's character that way, similar to how you empathized with Joel, with Ellie in the first game, which is fine, don't get me wrong, but the focus of this game should be her storyline as it relates to Ellie, right? It's amazing how you play 10 hours in this other story of Abby, and only when she returns back to the aquarium, for the most part, seeing the death of Owen, seeing the death of Meg, and after Yara's been killed, coming back from the island, or while she was on the island, coming back from it, you get that kind of collision of, her wanting to seek revenge on Ellie because she knows exactly what's happening. And to be fair, I don't even think she knows at that point that it's Ellie that's killing her friends. She has to actually go and physically confront her until she figures this out. She's kind of shell-shocked when this happens. Had this been a a better story that interweaved the narratives of Abby and Ellie to a greater extent, I think that would have been a greater emotional payoff overall. I'm not saying I know how they would have done it. And I'm not saying even that the story with involving Lev and Yara and Abby is particularly bad. One of the things that I ultimately came back to with this game, and I had to question, was that if Abby's story had been a separate DLC developed, let's say, a year, 2 years later for The Last of Us 2, would I have hated this game or disliked this game as much as I did? The ultimate answer for me was yes. I mean, I wouldn't have hated this. What I mean is, I wouldn't have hated this game this much. As its own self-contained story, it's actually quite interesting. It has everything. It's unique. It's got its own set pieces. It does intertwine with, Ellie's story, not to a great extent, especially on that level with Tommy, which I think is quite honestly one of the best, where he's sniping them. It's one of the best action set pieces in video game history and what Naughty Dog is known for. But as it's told in this way, it feels just like a slog trying to get through area to area. Not saying even that the level design is bad. There's some phenomenal level design in Abby's storyline, especially the scenes with the skyscrapers. It was only that was actually one of the first and only areas where I felt true tension. Also the scene where, you're running from the Seraphites after almost being hanged by them and the kids rescuing you. That is some truly terrifying stuff. Again, the sniper mission, we are essentially being gunned down, and you have to make your way all the way up to that bridge. Phenomenal stuff. But again, the way it's told, the players deserved better, honestly. To think that they spent 7 years developing this game, and this was the final product, and what must have been left on the cutting room floor, I cannot imagine. And the other thing, what's also interesting about this game is you play by yourself as Abby, but usually when you play as Ellie, you're playing with an NPC like Dina or Jesse, which is so weird because I did not feel a lot of tension in this game throughout the whole thing. I felt very much in control of the situation, unlike the last game where there was like ton of tension in almost every scene, and it was just like a well-crafted gem. This story just jumps around with its narrative so much that I not only just got confused and discombobulated, but it was just kind of sloppy writing all around, if I'm being honest. I don't know what to do with this. Owen, Meg, Danny, I don't like them. They're very underdeveloped. They're, in fact, I'd go as far as to say one-dimensional. They act as their own kind of archetypes, however you want to put it. I was actually more interested in Isaac and that character as being the head of the WLF wanting to get revenge on the Seraphites, and then you get thrown into the Civil War, which admittedly is phenomenal. It's actually quite, that set piece where you're on the horse galloping through Haven, I think it's called, which is on the island, and they're battling it out. I wish I would saw more of that. But this game also has an interesting flaw in it that I don't think a lot of players pick up on. And it's that you really have no agency in terms of the decisions you ultimately make. Now, at the end of the last game, the player doesn't have that either. You shoot the head surgeon, the lead surgeon, and at the end you're kind of left with an ambiguous or ambivalent ending wherein Ellie, he says, she asks him point blank, swear to me that this is what happened. Then she goes, I swear, or he goes, I swear. And she goes, okay, and you're kind of left with it. This game, you have no choice in Ellie's storyline and Abby's storyline. And what I mean by that is, like, there's a scene, for instance, where Ellie confronts Nora in the basement as to where Abby is. And at this point, she was always immune to the spores, but she's dying from the spores. And she asks, where is she? And she gives it to her, but ultimately, through a quick time event no less, the player basically beats her to death. And my question is, in a scene like that, why aren't you given the choice to either beat her to death with a quick time event or just let her die as she is, just waiting a few minutes and having her kind of perish or turn it's questions like that that really question it. And going back to my other criticism with the gameplay, this would have been a very different game had you been given the option of not to shiv everyone and kind of just being able to put them in like a chokehold. And I know how the game registers that as a kill, but I never saw it that way. So it allows you to do that for Abby. You can basically go around and put everyone in a chokehold. Granted, it takes longer, and you're at greater risk for being seen, which I think adds a lot more tension to her gameplay. But with Ellie, you only get the option to shank them. And so it's also like Druckmann and the team are purposely and deliberately making Ellie to be the revenge psychopath and, Abby to be, with her storyline, the kind-hearted soldier with the heart of gold. And then you start to question everything about this game and the ways it deliberately sets, these two apart. And while it tries really hard to show you two sides of the same coin, that's ultimately not the case, because in these certain instances, it purposely makes you feel one way and purposely makes you feel another way. In other words, they try and make Ellie's character to be more of the monster, and they make Abby's character to be more like the hero. So, after you play about 12 hours with Abby, you're ultimately, the timelines sync and they converge, and you're ultimately back at the theater. And in one of the probably grossest final battles that I've ever seen as a more or less conclusion to the game, it's certainly the climax of the game, in my opinion. You have Abby, a character who I don't like, who killed Joel, playing a deadly cat and mouse game for all intents and purposes, with my favorite character, who's also weaker, by the way. I don't know why they didn't revert it back to Ellie, because at this point I feel no sympathy for Abby. And just when Abby is about to kill Dina, who is also pregnant and who she would have killed, with absolutely no remorse, Lev tells her to stop, and she lets them both go in kind of an act of, I don't know if attrition's the right word, but in an act of mercy. And this heavy-handed theme of, violence being a never-ending cycle is broken, I guess. And I guess that's one of the themes that this game really tries to convey, that, revenge or the seeking of revenge is just a never-ending cycle of violence, but it's not good. Also, I want to touch upon, while we're talking about the ending, I might as well just talk about this. When I brought up that this game is going to change the industry for the better in a lot of ways, I truly meant that. I won't touch upon this long, but first of all, Naughty Dog made deceptive trailers to make it seem like you're going to be playing with Joel or Ellie for the whole game. They've actually said in previous interviews that you only play as one character. So they lied about that, and they purposely kind of deceived consumers in that regard. They only allowed reviewers to review the first, basically Ellie's portion, the first 10 to 12 hours of the game, not allowed to reveal Abby's storyline in the review. And yet, here these journalists were giving glowing 10 out of 10 reviews, even if they felt, hopefully, the story was lackluster, which led me to believe either one of three things, and I'm going to see if I can remember these three things accurately. Number one, they're either these big conglomerates that are beholden to their advertisers, and had they give anything below an 8, for example, or a 9, they would have lost revenue. Secondly, they were probably these smaller independent outfits that couldn't afford to lose money. And had they given a less than stellar review of the game, it would have strained the relationship between them and Sony, and them and Naughty Dog for receiving future review copies of the game. And third, it's just the fact that Sony put an embargo on you can only review half the game. I mean, this is basically unheard of. It's certainly unheard of. Like, can you imagine if, I understand video games are different, but can you imagine reviewing a movie and based on only the first half of it, or a book by the first half of it? Can you imagine reviewing the movie Parasite only having watched the up until halfway. When I say that this game is going to change the industry for the better, what I mean by that is people are going to be skeptical about journalistic reviews of games going forward. They're going to wait. They're not going to base things on hype. But I think this is just an example of a big, developer deceiving their consumer base. And I think they lost a lot of goodwill and trust with the fans of Naughty Dog. They certainly lost my goodwill, I'll say that. There's also issues of basically anyone. So I was fortunate enough not to have seen the leaks before this game released. So I didn't know what was coming. I went into this game completely blind. But when YouTubers and critics saw the leaks and reviewed the leaks, I think it was Sony and or Naughty Dog purposely put strikes on their channel and block their videos, trying to hold back the spoilers before the release of the game, which is just kind of sick. And I'm not going to lie, this game, if Druckmann's purpose was for me to feel things, it made me feel things. I'll say that. I felt anger, I felt rage, I felt sadness, but not for the reasons they hoped I would feel anger and sadness and hate and rage. It is just stunning that after 7 years, this is the best that they could do. The fans deserved better. Naughty Dog deserved better. I didn't make any notes for this video, so I'm just trying to think back. Is there anything else that I wanted to talk about this game? Oh yeah, there was one thing. Early on in the game, you play in this kind of limited open world area of downtown Seattle. So basically you have this area where you have maybe a dozen buildings and you can go to them at your own pace. And I thought this was actually quite innovative. You can go at your own pace. You could seek out different buildings, kind of give you a little more freedom as to where you want to go, which led me to believe that this would happen later on in the game. But you know what? Sure enough, it doesn't. And I question why that is, because this was actually one of the more innovative things in the game. I would have loved to have explored certain areas of the certain pockets of Seattle at my own pace. They give you this great limited, map that you can, that you check off and mark up as you search from place to place. I was just very disappointed by The Last of Us 2. And it wasn't that the story was bad per se. There is a great story in here somewhere. But the way it's told is just contrived. It's muddled. Kind of a mess, if I'm being perfectly honest. It taints my love for the first game. It really, I guess, was one of those cases of lightning in a bottle. So I think I'm going to end it here right now because I just honestly want to get some of my views out there, put on paper. Oh, that's the other thing. At the ending of this, the ending I'll talk about. After that big confrontation in the movie theater, you get to basically kind of an idyllic ending of Ellie and Dina and Jesse's baby and their baby, JJ, I think his name is. And the ending was so idyllic that I thought it was actually a dream sequence. I thought they were actually left to die at the movie theater, and that was kind of the life that they had imagined that they would be living. But even if that's not the case, even given that it isn't the case, that's what really happened. They got a farm and whatnot, the life they always wanted. If the game had ended there with with Ellie's PTSD of Joel's death still in her, that would have been perfectly fine. In fact, I probably would have preferred that. Instead, what they do is Ellie has to go back to Santa Barbara to kill Abby. She just can't let it go. And for me, it is just the stupidest idea ever. And it's completely at odds with her character. Because you have to remember, she's not in Seattle when she goes to Santa Barbara. I believe she's in Wyoming. So she has to go to Wyoming to the coast, and from the coast go to Santa Barbara, which in and of itself, in today's society, is a big trip if you're taking it by car, right? And the game pads it out with probably, if I had to guess, 3 or 4 more hours of a new location, of a new area, of new enemies, new characters even. And given the amount of crunch that the developers had to put into this game, it made me feel really bad for them, because that's basically a 20% of the game, if I had to guess, maybe a little less. Considering the time and effort that went into this game, it made me feel sorry for the developers that they had this whole swath of the game when they really didn't need to. It's also a very long game, if I'm being honest, maybe too long. But once they get to the Rattlers, which are these kind of slave-holding biker gang, I don't know how else to call them, that was actually very interesting. And I wanted to know more about them. And why wasn't stuff like that in the game more so or earlier as part of the main story? So, she, again, single-handedly takes on this biker gang, much in the way she single-handedly took on the WLF. And she finds Abby, hanging from a post, near death, cuts her down, she rescues Lev, and just as they're about to go their separate ways, she still feels the need to fight and kill Abby. It's only when she has her head deep in underwater that at the last second she decides to let her live, and we get the final cutscene of Joel and Ellie, wherein Ellie starts to forgive Joel, or is on the way to forgiving Joel, and she lets her go. And in the process, she loses 2 fingers after Abby bites them off. This game would have been amazing if they showed the gradual decline of Ellie. I mean, it does this, don't get me wrong, but it does this. I mean, because you have to remember that in that last section of the game, you haven't played as Ellie for 10 hours? And then it jumps a year ahead, and then you go back. It's so weird. You play as Ellie on the 3rd day of Seattle, or you play as Abby, rather, in that final confrontation, and then it jumps a year to this idyllic situation, and then probably a few months of her just going to Santa Barbara, and then she finally returns home, and Dina's not there anymore. Had this been a game that solely focused on Ellie's kind of decline and descent from the girl we see in the first game to the monster or shell of a human being that we see at the end of this game, that would have been a great, compelling story. To be honest, I was talking with my friend. He came up with an even better story than this in 5 minutes. And I know this is kind of going back to me speculating on this is the game that I didn't get, but it went something like this. Basically, you start the game with Ellie. You play her storyline. You start them in sequential order, the flashbacks, and then you get to the point where she's in Jacksonville 2 years ago, and you have her just play a quarter of the game, just her getting to Utah, getting back there. She finds the truth, and, just as she does, she gets captured. Or for that matter, Joel catches up with her. She hates him for it. They go back together, and something happens. They get captured or separated, wherein Joel gets killed. She's nearly at death, soon to be released by Abby, who is not her captor, by the way, who is just some person who stumbled upon her about to be hanged and saves her. But before that, you play a few hours as Abby. You start to see her storyline, not knowing that she's actually going to kill Joel later on in the game. Then it reaches up to that point where she rescues her. Then you play as Abby and Ellie together. You play them for a few hours, trying to rescue Joel. And then she kind of lures both of them in the same fashion to her friends, and Joel is killed. And by this point, it's maybe 6 to 10 hours into the game, and then it happens. And from there, you can write your own story. But it just goes to show you that there were other ways that this could have been handled, better ways it could have been handled. Because had we been able to play more as Abby, not knowing what was going to happen with her or what she was going to do, we would have sympathized with her that way. And that's the other thing. This game, someone should have told the developers at Naughty Dog not to do such a good job of being able to kill people in this game. One of the things that actually is a big standout in this game, now that I'm just thinking about it, is it makes the violence in this game so much more brutal than any other game I've played before. First of all, if you use any kind of explosives, you basically see people get blown up into chunks, or see their, or in in two. You see people get eviscerated from, disemboweled. You see her, shooting arrows in people's heads, and they actually show it. They show people, getting impaled with these giant melee knives and such. Like, this is not easy stuff to watch. But at the same time, as time goes on, it almost starts to become comical. Like, the fact that the enemies shout out, like, oh my God, they killed Derek, actually becomes kind of laughable after a while. Like, that's not how you get me to empathize with the character. But at the same time, it's a good way of just showing how, form equals function, right? The fact that these deaths are so brutal makes you realize that, makes you realize, like, what kind of a monster you've become in this game. It has kind of this weird dual effect. It's hard to explain, but I think they did a really great job. I haven't seen a game where, you play Call of Duty, you kill a soldier, they just, they fall down, they disappear, and that's the end of it. This game, you really feel the violence. But if I could just, in conclusion, I was very disappointed by this game, story-wise. And it just goes to show you how much story really affects everything else in this game. If I had to rate it out of 10, certainly I would say it's a solid 7. I might even give it lower, or would have given it lower had coming off of just playing 30 hours of it. But honestly, at this time, yeah, I think it's a solid 7, and I'm going to leave with that. So really just wanted to get my thoughts and opinions out there. I think talking through it really helped me get through this game. I guess I'm a little late to the party now that it's several weeks ahead, but better late than never. Don't know what I'm going to do for my future videos. To be honest, I was thinking of doing 12 tips for playing The Last of Us 2, but if I'm being blunt, I don't even want to talk about this game for a while. So, leave your comments below. Feel free to like this video, subscribe to my channel. I do appreciate your feedback, and you know what, just keep the comments civil. And did you agree with me? Are there certain aspects that you felt were done better or done worse than what I said? Any stuff I left out, feel free to put in the comments as well. Otherwise, just stay safe out there, and I will continue to stream my channel for the foreseeable future. All right, guys, take it easy.